June 6, 1944, 7:25 a.m. Dog White Sector, Omaha Beach, Normandy. Salt water mixed with blood as Brigadier General Norman Dutch Cota pressed against the shingle bank, his uniform already soaked with seawater and sweat. Through the roar of machine guns and the crash of mortars, he opened his waterproof notebook and wrote one short line with a shaking hand. The plan has failed. Everything we prepared for is wrong. Now we must turn disaster into victory. Peering through binoculars just above the seawall, he saw what Allied leaders had insisted would not happen. Omaha was a killing ground. The naval bombardment had missed its targets. American troops were being cut down in rows. At 51 years old, Cota stood frozen for a moment, watching America's young men collapse in the sand, their bodies pulled back and forth by the bloody tide. Hours earlier, on the USS Charles Carroll, Cota had warned his staff about the risk of confusion. But this was not confusion, it was slaughter. The Atlantic Wall still stood firm. The Germans weren't weak conscripts as promised, but hardened veterans of the 352nd Infantry Division. The craters that planners said would give cover were nowhere to be found. The beach lay wide open, every inch swept by interlocking fields of fire. In just the first 2 hours, 2,400 Americans would fall as casualties at Omaha. The beach itself became a 300-yard-wide death trap. What no one on that beach realized was that this nightmare would give rise to one of the greatest battlefield turnarounds in modern history, because one general refused to let defeat stand. The disaster didn't start that morning. It had been set in motion months earlier. The invasion was built on layers of optimism and overconfidence. As one of the senior advisors in Operation Overlord, Cota had been appointed Assistant Division Commander of the 29th Infantry Division. This National Guard division, nicknamed the Blue and Gray for its mix of Union and Confederate state units, had never fought in combat before. They were to land with the battle-tested 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, in what planners called a straightforward assault against weak defenders. But Cota had long doubted those promises. At a landing operations conference the year before, he had argued strongly against a daylight attack. It is granted that strategical surprise will be impossible, but tactical surprise is another matter. It is one of the strongest factors in achieving success. That is why I favor a night landing. I do not believe the daylight assault can succeed. His words were brushed aside. The High Command, certain of their power in numbers, believed massive air and naval strikes would wipe out German positions. Soldiers were told they'd face little resistance. Intelligence claimed Omaha was guarded by the 716th Static Division, older men and foreign troops with little fight left in them. The truth was far different. In the weeks before the invasion, the German 352nd Infantry Division, combat veterans fresh from the Eastern Front, had quietly taken over the sector. They brought with them 88mm guns, heavy mortars, and perfectly arranged machine gun nests. Every part of the beach could be hit with deadly precision. Among the Americans preparing to land was 19-year-old Private Harold Baumgarten of Company B, 116th Infantry Regiment, 29th Division. From New York City, he had joined the National Guard to escape the dullness of civilian life. Packed into a landing craft with 30 men, he watched the French coast loom closer in the pale dawn. The promised bombardment had already ended before they arrived, leaving the beach looking untouched, a terrible sign. Sergeant Robert Slaughter of Company D, 116th Infantry, remembered the briefing. They told us it would be a walkover. The Air Force would bomb them flat. The Navy would blast them to pieces. We'd just walk in and clean up. Some of the boys were actually disappointed. They thought they'd missed the real fight. Captain Charles Cawthon, commanding Company K, 116th Infantry, wasn't so easily convinced. A college-educated officer from Virginia, he had risen through the National Guard ranks and had studied military history closely. He knew war never followed a perfect script. The Allied plan was far too rigid, too full of assumptions, and far too optimistic. At 6:30 a.m. H hour, the first wave hit Omaha. Within moments, the invasion plan collapsed. German machine guns, untouched by the bombardment, opened fire from hidden positions. The 88mm guns began ripping apart landing craft and men alike. Company A, 116th Infantry, landing at Dog Green Sector directly in front of the Vierville Draw, was destroyed within 10 minutes. Of its 230 men, only 18 would survive without wounds. Their commander, Captain Taylor Fellers, was killed before reaching the sand. His second-in-command died seconds later. Private Baumgarten's landing craft took a direct hit from an 88mm shell, just 50 yards from the beach. The explosion tore men apart instantly. Somehow Baumgarten survived, though thrown into deep water while weighed down with 60 pounds of gear. He ditched his pack, inflated his life vest, and fought toward shore as machine gun rounds churned the water around him. The man on his left was decapitated. The man on his right vanished beneath the waves. On Dog White, where Cota himself would land, Company C, 116th Infantry, lost half its men before even reaching the seawall. Those who made it across the 300 yards arrived without officers, without weapons, and nearly without hope. They lay pressed against the 4-foot-high stone barrier, the only cover available, waiting for the end. The 5th Ranger Battalion, elite soldiers trained for just this type of mission, were shredded as well. Lieutenant Colonel Max Schneider, their commander, saw his lead companies cut down as they tried to storm the bluffs. The Rangers had been taught to push forward no matter the cost. But this was a nightmare beyond their training. At 7:25 a.m., Cota landed with men of the 116th Infantry in the second wave at Dog White. His landing craft was raked by machine gun, mortar, and artillery fire. 3 soldiers were killed as soon as they stepped off. Cota, the oldest man to set foot on Omaha that morning and the highest-ranking officer on the beach, saw a scene worse than any briefing had warned. Bodies lay across the sand and floated in the surf. Rifles, helmets, packs, and shattered equipment littered the beach. Sherman tanks from the 741st Tank Battalion, 29 in all, had launched in support, but 27 had sunk in the rough water, leaving only a few burning hulks. Even worse than the wreckage was the paralysis of the survivors. Soldiers pressed against the seawall, staring blankly, their weapons clogged with sand and water. They were not cowards, they were young men who had been promised an easy landing, only to be dropped into hell itself. Lieutenant Jack Shea, Cota's 24-year-old aide from Tennessee, followed closely as they moved along the wall. He had never seen the general falter before, but now Cota stood still, silently taking in the scale of the disaster. Then, without a word, he rose to his feet. "He just stood up," Shea later said, "right there in the middle of that fire." He stood up and started walking down the beach like it was a Sunday stroll. At first, many thought General Cota had lost his senses. What happened next, however, would enter the history books. Ignoring the storm of bullets and explosions, Cota walked up and down the beach, pulling scattered groups together and directing their fire. But he didn't just reorganize men. He gave them back their will to fight simply by being there. When he came across a group of Rangers pinned near the seawall, he asked their unit. "5th Rangers," they replied. Cota's response became a motto that the Rangers still carry to this day. "Rangers lead the way." To another cluster of soldiers frozen with fear, Cota gave them words that struck like a jolt of electricity. "Gentlemen, we are being killed on the beaches. Let us go inland and be killed." The grim humor worked. If death was coming anyway, better to meet it charging forward than lying helpless in the sand. And Cota wasn't all talk. When he found a captain unsure how to deal with a fortified German position, the general showed him firsthand. "Here's what you do, Captain. You and your men keep them busy with fire. I'll take a squad and show you how to clear a house full of Germans." After the attack succeeded, Cota turned back to the young officer. "Now you see how it's done? I won't be around to do this again. You'll have to handle it from here." Private First Class Charles Neighbor of Company C, 116th Infantry, remembered that moment vividly. "We were finished. Guys were crying, praying, even trying to dig holes in the pebbles with their helmets. Then this general just walks up in the middle of all that fire, smoking a cigarette like he's at a garden party. He looks at us and says, 'What are you doing lying there? Let's get the hell out of here.' The effect was instant. If a general could stand tall through that kind of fire, what excuse did the rest of them have for hiding? Men began to rise, first one, then a few, then whole groups. At 7:50 a.m., Cota personally led the push-off Dog White, between strong points WN-68 and WN-70. Using a Bangalore torpedo and wire cutters, they forced an opening in the German defenses. The first man through was killed instantly by machine gun fire. The rest froze. Cota didn't hesitate. He ran through the gap himself, sprinting across the road. The sight of a general leading from the front broke the spell. The men surged after him, climbing the bluff under fire. Sergeant Jack Richardson of the 5th Rangers recalled, "We were trained to be tough, to never quit, but that beach broke us. We were ready to give up. Then this old man, he looked ancient to us, charges up the bluff like he's 20 years old. What choice did we have but to follow? Within 20 minutes, the 5th Rangers joined in, blasting more gaps. By 9 a.m., over 600 American troops had made it to the top of the bluff opposite Dog White and were pushing inland. The breakthrough wasn't one sudden victory, but dozens of small ones. A machine gun nest silenced here, a minefield crossed there. Each success inspired the next. Soldiers who had been paralyzed with fear just an hour before were now attacking German positions with furious determination. Cota's breakthrough sent a wave of confidence across Omaha Beach. Word spread along the seawall. Someone had reached the top. If one group could do it, others could too. On Easy Red Sector, Colonel George Taylor of the 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Division, rallied his men with his own unforgettable words. "There are two kinds of people staying on this beach. Those who are dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here." All along the beach, small bands of soldiers, often led by lieutenants or sergeants, began climbing the bluffs. They didn't follow the carefully marked paths, which were death traps. They carved their own routes, cutting wire, disarming mines with bayonets, clawing up the cliffs like mountaineers. Technical Sergeant William Wiederhold of the 116th Infantry remembered, "It was like watching men come back from the dead. One minute they were beaten, the next they were fighting like demons. All because one general showed them it could be done." The turnaround at Omaha can only be understood through the men who lived it. Each soldier fought his own battle from despair to resolve, but nearly all pointed to the same figure, Dutch Cota. Private First Class Felix Branham of Company K, 116th Infantry recalled, "I was lying behind a dead soldier, using his body for cover. I'd given up. I was just waiting for my turn. Then I see this general walking the beach. He stops by me and says, 'Son, you're not doing any good there. Let's go kill some Germans.' How could I say no to that?" Sergeant Lawrence Fitzsimmons of the 5th Rangers told it this way, "We were Rangers, the best of the best. But that beach broke us. We'd lost half our officers in the first 10 minutes. Then Cota shows up and tells us to lead the way. It wasn't just an order, it was a challenge. He was saying, 'You call yourselves Rangers? Prove it.' And by God, we did." Captain Joseph Dawson of Company G, 16th Infantry, remembered being isolated at the far east end of Omaha. "We'd gotten up the bluff, but we were alone, pinned down. Then we saw men coming from the west, Cota's men. Suddenly we weren't alone anymore. The whole beach was moving." Lieutenant Walter Taylor of Company B, 116th Infantry, described the same transformation. "My company was gone. Out of 200, I had maybe 20 left. Then Cota comes up and says, 'Lieutenant, get these men moving.' I told him, 'General, we've lost the officers, the sergeants, our weapons are jammed with sand.' He looked me in the eye and said, 'Lieutenant, I don't care if you have to throw rocks. Get moving.' So we did." The contrast between planning and reality could not have been sharper. The plan, naval bombardment, would leave craters for cover. Reality, the beach was flat, exposed, and bare. The plan, bombers would destroy German defenses. Reality, cloud cover pushed the bombs inland, missing the targets entirely. The plan, DD tanks would provide support from the sea. Reality, 27 of 29 sank in the rough waves. The plan, weak garrison troops would resist half-heartedly. Reality, the battle-hardened 352nd Infantry Division was waiting. The plan, generals would command from offshore. Reality, Norman Cota was on the sand leading the charge himself. The experience of Omaha followed a clear path in the minds of those who fought. At 6:30 a.m., despair. By mid-morning, determination. And by the afternoon, victory. Pulled from disaster by leadership, courage, and the refusal of one general to surrender. At 6:45 a.m., American troops expected the bombardment to have wiped out German defenses. Instead, nothing had been destroyed. Machine gun fire cut them down. Shock spread. Men realized they were trapped and being slaughtered. By 7 a.m., despair set in. Soldiers whispered to each other, "This is impossible. We're all going to die here." At 7:30 a.m., fear froze entire units. Many felt helpless, waiting for the end. But by 8 a.m., though, everything changed. Inspiration spread as men saw a general walking upright under fire. If he could do it, so could they. At 8:30 am, determination replaced fear. Soldiers vowed to push up the bluffs even if it meant dying trying. By 9 a.m., against all odds, the impossible was happening. The Americans were breaking through. The shift can be measured by the numbers. 6:30 a.m., 0 Americans off the beach. 7:30 a.m., about 100 men clung to the seawall. 8 a.m., the first troops broke through the bluffs. 9 a.m., roughly 600 men reached the top. 10 a.m., multiple exits secured. By noon, troops were pushing inland. By 6 p.m., Omaha Beach was firmly in American hands. The cost was staggering. In the first wave, most units suffered between 50 and 70% casualties. Company A of the 116th Infantry lost 96% of its men. Overall, around 2,400 Americans became casualties at Omaha on D-Day. Without Brigadier General Norman Dutch Cota, the entire landing could have failed. Even the Germans saw the sudden shift. At 8:35 a.m., the 352nd Infantry Division reported enemy penetration near Colville. By 10 a.m., the enemy had seized the heights at Saint Laurent. At noon, they admitted they could not hold without reinforcements. But this wasn't just a tactical victory. It was a lesson in leadership. Cota didn't stay behind issuing orders. He walked into danger, shoulder to shoulder with his men. When he saw a wounded soldier unable to move, Cota didn't step over him. He stopped in the middle of gunfire and directed medics to help. When he came across captured Germans, he made sure they were treated properly, even while American bodies covered the beach. When engineers said they didn't have explosives to clear a concrete wall, Cota noticed a tank loaded with TNT, but nobody wanted to drive it forward under fire. Cota challenged them. Hasn't anyone got guts enough to drive it down? A young soldier finally stepped up and Cota slapped him on the back. That's the stuff. God damn it. Get moving. This wasn't recklessness. It was deliberate leadership. Cota knew men needed to see courage to find their own, and he showed it again and again that morning. Private Robert Sales of the 116th Infantry later recalled, "He wasn't Superman. You could see he was scared. His hands shook when he lit his cigarette. But he did what had to be done anyway. That's why we followed him. If he could do it scared, we could too." Omaha Beach shattered American military doctrine. Everything the Army had been taught about amphibious assaults collapsed in a few hours. Doctrine said, massive firepower ensures success. Reality, firepower failed, but courage carried the day. Doctrine said, careful planning prevents chaos. Reality, plans fell apart almost instantly. Doctrine said, technology guarantees victory. Reality, it was human leadership that made the difference. Doctrine said, generals command from safety. Reality, a general on the front lines turned disaster into victory. Colonel Charles Canham, commander of the 116th Infantry, who was wounded 4 times on June 6, later wrote, "Every manual, every training exercise, every assumption we had was wrong. We succeeded because one general threw away the book and led from the front." Even the Germans noticed. Oberst Ernst Goth, commanding the 916th Grenadier Regiment, reported at 7:30 a.m. that the American attack was collapsing. By 9 a.m. his defenses had been pierced at several points. He admitted the sudden change was mysterious. Only later did he learn a general had personally led the assault. His comment, "This explains everything." The most surprising detail about Cota's leadership came to light only after the war. On June 5th, aboard the USS Charles Carroll, he had warned his staff exactly what was about to happen. The landing craft won't arrive on time. Units will land in the wrong places. Some won't land at all. We must improvise, adapt, and keep going. This wasn't pessimism, it was preparation. While other commanders told their men everything would go smoothly, Cota prepared his troops for chaos. He had studied every amphibious assault in history and knew that none went according to plan. In England, he trained his men for failure. He called it broken field running, teaching them to push forward when things went wrong, to adjust and to keep moving. Lieutenant Jack Shea later explained, "While everyone else was practicing perfect landings, the general made us practice when everything went wrong. He'd say, what if there's no cover? What if the tanks don't arrive? What if you're in the wrong place?" We thought he was crazy. Turns out he was the only one ready. Cota's actions didn't just turn Omaha Beach from near disaster to victory. They shaped the entire campaign in Europe. His leadership on June 6th was proof that in the chaos of war, courage, adaptability, and example matter more than doctrine. By nightfall, Omaha Beach was secure. Despite the disastrous beginning, 34,000 American troops had landed. The beachhead was linked with Utah and the British beaches. German counterattacks were beaten back. The outcome was decisive. Normandy was now firmly in Allied hands. The buildup continued on schedule, and the Germans had lost their chance to drive the Allies back into the sea. From that moment forward, the liberation of France was certain. The long-term consequences were just as important. Military doctrine was rewritten to stress leadership over firepower. The Ranger motto, inspired by Cota's words, was made permanent. Officer training shifted focus to personal leadership in battle. Flexibility, not rigid planning, became the priority. On June 29, 1944, Brigadier General Norman Cota received the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership, bravery, and devotion to duty. Many historians, including Stephen Ambrose, argued he deserved the Medal of Honor. Even today, there are efforts to award it to him posthumously. But Cota's greatest impact wasn't written in medals or books. It was in the thousands of men who survived Omaha because of him. They returned home, raised families, built careers, and lived full lives because one man refused to give up on June 6th. The military record makes the change clear. Before Cota's intervention, between 6:30 and 7:30 a.m., there were 0 penetrations of the German defenses. 90% of the troops were trapped at the water's edge or against the seawall. The first wave had suffered about 40% casualties. Not a single vehicle had made it off the beach. Naval gunfire was useless because there were no spotters. The command structure had collapsed. After Cota's breakthrough, by 8 a.m. and into the afternoon, 5 exits had been blasted through the bluffs. A steady stream of troops was moving inland. Artillery observers were in position on the high ground, making naval gunfire effective. Command control was restored. German defenses were breaking apart. German records tell the same story. At 7:35 a.m., attack repulsed with heavy losses. At 8:55 a.m., enemy infiltrating positions. At 10:15 a.m., cannot hold without reinforcement. By 12 p.m., positions overrun, withdrawing. 50 years later, on June 6, 1994, the surviving veterans of Omaha gathered again for the 50th anniversary of D-Day. Among them was Jack Shea, Cota's aide, now 74 years old. Standing on the sand where he had once expected to die, Shea told the crowd, "People ask me what I remember most about D-Day. It wasn't the noise or the death or even the fear, though there was plenty of all three. What I remember is one man standing when everyone else was lying down, one man walking when everyone else was crawling, one man saying, 'Follow me,' when others said it was impossible. General Cota didn't win Omaha Beach by himself. We all did. But he showed us how. He showed us that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting in spite of it. He showed us that leadership isn't about giving orders. It's about going first. Ordinary men became extraordinary because he showed us the way. I'm an old man now. I've lived a full life. Marriage, children, grandchildren, a career. None of it would have happened without Dutch Cota. None of us would have left that beach without him." Shea looked out over the Normandy American Cemetery, with its 9,387 white crosses and stars of David, and added, "Each of these markers is a story cut short, but together they represent victory through sacrifice. General Cota proved that from the greatest disaster can come the greatest triumph. He taught us that defeat is never final unless you accept it. One man can make the difference between catastrophe and victory." The lessons from Omaha Beach go beyond military history. They reveal truths about leadership and human nature itself. Truth 1. Planning has limits. No matter how detailed, real life will not match the plan. Success depends on adapting, not on perfection. Truth 2. Technology is not decisive. Even with overwhelming firepower, the Allies almost failed. What saved Omaha were human factors: courage, leadership, determination. Truth 3. Leadership must be visible. In crisis, people need to see it, not just hear it. Cota's example changed the battlefield more than any order. Truth 4. Individual actions matter. One person's bravery can inspire thousands. Cota's courage rippled across the beach, sparking heroism that turned the tide. Truth 5. Age and rank don't matter in a crisis. Cota was older than most and could have stayed offshore, but he proved that leadership is responsibility, not privilege. Today, Omaha's reversal is studied worldwide as one of the clearest examples of leadership under fire. Military colleges use Cota's actions as case studies. The U.S. Army Leadership Manual cites his example. The Ranger's motto preserves his words. Business schools teach his methods as crisis leadership. Psychologists study the ripple effect of courage. The beach itself carries the legacy. Where machine guns once ruled, tourists now stroll. Where thousands fell, children now play. Where defeat seemed certain, monuments celebrate victory. At the Normandy Cemetery, a plaque honors Cota. When disaster threatened, one man's courage turned the tide. His influence extends across generations. Veterans of Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan have said they found inspiration in Cota's story, remembering the general who walked upright through gunfire, led from the front, and refused to quit. Colonel Ralph Ingersoll, who landed later that day, later wrote, "The beach was won by the sacrifice of brave men and the leadership of a few extraordinary officers. Chief among them was Dutch Cota. Without him, Omaha would have failed. Without Omaha, the invasion might have failed. Without the invasion, the war could have lasted years longer." Historians agree. Stephen Ambrose called Cota's leadership the greatest single example of battlefield command in American military history. John Keegan wrote, "Among all the acts of courage on D-Day, Cota's stands supreme." Biographer Carlo D'Este said, "Cota proved battles are still won by men, not machines." His leadership was worth whole divisions of reinforcements. Joseph Belkowski, the 29th Division historian, added, "He didn't just save Omaha Beach, he showed the world what leadership means." Dutch Cota's courage didn't just win a beach, it changed history. His example remains one of the clearest reminders that one person's bravery can alter the fate of thousands, and sometimes of nations. Cota never flinched, never paused, and never doubted what had to be done, getting his men off the deadly beaches of Omaha. The U.S. Army's official record later stated, "The breakthrough of Omaha's defenses was made possible by the initiative and bravery of small unit leaders and soldiers who drew strength from the personal leadership of General Cota." Even the Germans acknowledged this. General der Artillerie Erich Marx, who commanded the 84th Corps defending Normandy, reported that the first American assaults at Omaha were beaten back with heavy losses. But the sudden and determined push that followed took them by surprise, something he credited to extraordinary leadership at the tactical level. Cota's greatest legacy isn't just in medals or monuments, but in the institutions he shaped afterward. When the U.S. Army established Ranger School in 1950, it built directly on lessons from Omaha. The focus on small unit leadership, quick decisions, and adaptability came from that bloody day. Officer Candidate School also reshaped its training after World War II to emphasize leadership by example. Captured in the infantry school's motto, "Follow me." Every young lieutenant hears about the general who personally led men through the fire on Omaha Beach. Modern doctrine, what today we call mission command and decentralized execution, can be traced back to June 6, 1944. The collapse of rigid plans and the triumph of quick thinking changed how the U.S. military would fight. From that day forward, Special Operations Forces, Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Marine Raiders still study Cota's example, seeing in him the very values they would later adopt. On June 6, 2004, survivors gathered for the 60th anniversary of D-Day. Former Sergeant Bob Slaughter of the 116th Infantry reflected, "I've had 60 years to think about that day. 60 years to wonder why I lived when so many didn't. The only answer I can give is Dutch Cota. He gave us the courage to do the impossible." Former Captain John Ryan of the 5th Rangers said, "The brilliant leadership of men like General Cota, who risked everything when it mattered most, saved not only lives but the entire operation. Without his breakthrough, Omaha would have been lost." Private Felix Brum of the 116th Infantry added a deeply personal tribute. "I named my first son Norman after General Cota. When people ask why, I tell them because without Norman Cota, I wouldn't have had a son to name." Cota's leadership on Omaha carried moral weight in an age when machines often seem to overshadow humanity. He proved that character still mattered, even in a war defined by tanks, planes, and artillery. He showed that courage, when visible, could turn the tide of battle. His actions raised timeless questions. What makes men follow a leader into near certain death? How do broken troops become fighters again? How does one man's courage spread to thousands? The answer lies in human nature. Men followed Cota because he never asked them to do what he wasn't willing to do himself. They found courage because he showed them it was possible, and just as fear spreads quickly, so does courage. Chaplain George Wood, who landed with the 29th Division, later said, "I saw men die that day, and I saw men rise above death." General Cota showed us that some things are worth dying for, but more importantly that some things are worth living for: duty, honor, and the man fighting next to you. Of course, not all views of Cota's actions are entirely positive. Some military experts argue that better planning could have avoided the need for such desperate heroism. Critics point out that since Cota predicted disaster at Omaha, more preventive measures should have been taken. Colonel S.L.A. Marshall, the Army's official historian, wrote, "While Cota's bravery is unquestioned, the fact that a general had to personally lead assault teams shows a breakdown in planning and preparation." British Brigadier David Belcom noted, "Americans often glorify individual heroism, which sometimes hides bigger failures. Omaha required heroism because intelligence, planning, and tactics had all fallen short. These critiques are valid but miss the larger truth. War is chaos and no plan survives first contact with the enemy. Cota's brilliance wasn't in preventing disaster, but in pulling victory from the jaws of defeat. His adaptability was his genius. The most important shift at Omaha wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. In the span of 3 hours, American soldiers went from expecting total defeat to achieving victory. One man's example triggered that transformation. Private Harold Baumgarten, who landed thinking the beach would be unopposed, ended the day a hardened veteran who had helped capture the high ground. He later wrote, "I walked into the water a boy. I came out a soldier. Omaha was our crucible and General Cota was the spark." The lessons of Omaha spread across the U.S. Army itself. Before that day, the Army still carried the idea that American spirit alone could carry battles. After Omaha, it was clear: spirit needed leadership, courage needed example, and victory demanded sacrifice. The survival of Omaha Beach shaped the entire 20th century. Without success there, the invasion might have failed, allowing German forces to crush the other landings. The Allies could have been pushed back into the sea. The war in Europe might have dragged on for years. The Soviet Union could have overrun all of Germany, reshaping the map of Europe and extending the Cold War's reach. Millions more could have died. Instead, Omaha succeeded. The Allies secured their foothold. France was liberated on schedule. Germany was forced into a three-front war. Within 11 months, Europe was free, democracy was restored to the West, NATO was born, and the post-war world took shape. Historian Max Hastings wrote that the margin between victory and defeat at Omaha was razor thin, and Cota tipped the balance. It's no exaggeration to say the course of modern history shifted because of one man's courage on one morning. Yet behind the legend was a man who paid a personal price. Leading from the front meant living with the certainty that he might not survive. He had a wife, Connie, waiting in England, and a son, Norman Jr., flying combat missions. He had every reason to protect his life, yet he risked it again and again. After the war, Cota rarely spoke of D-Day. When pressed, he would simply say, "I did what any officer should do, led his men." His humility hides just how rare his actions were. Not every officer could or would have done what he did. Cota retired on June 30th, 1946, as a permanent major general. He lived quietly until his death on October 4th, 1971, at age 78. He was laid to rest at West Point, beneath a plain headstone that gives no clue to the enormity of his deeds. His widow, Connie, later said, "Dutch never thought of himself as a hero. He always said the heroes were the ones who didn't come home. But I knew, and we all knew, that without him, many more wouldn't have." The story of Omaha Beach offers enduring lessons for leaders everywhere. Lesson 1. Always prepare for failure. Cota prevailed because he expected chaos and trained his men to deal with it. Leaders today should plan not only for success but also for recovery when things go wrong. Lesson 2. Lead from the front. In crisis, people don't just need orders, they need to see courage in action. Lesson 3. Individual actions matter. One person's bravery can inspire thousands. Never underestimate the power of example. Lesson 4. Flexibility is stronger than rigidity. The original plan at Omaha collapsed, but Cota's ability to adapt saved the day. In unpredictable situations, being flexible matters more than having every detail written down in advance. Lesson 5. Character determines the outcome. On paper, the Allies had every advantage: technology, firepower, and manpower. Yet they nearly lost. What made the difference wasn't equipment, but courage, determination, and leadership. On June 6, 2014, the 70th anniversary of D-Day, the last large reunion of Omaha Beach veterans took place. Fewer than 50 remained, most well into their 90s. They stood quietly on the same beach where they once believed they would die, now calm and peaceful. The keynote address was delivered by James Shea, the son of Jack Shea, who had been General Cota's aide. James read from his father's final letter, written before his death in 2011. "I am the last of Cota's staff, the last who remembers him as a man, not a legend." That morning he was afraid, just like the rest of us. His hands shook, his voice cracked. But he did his duty anyway. That isn't legendary, that's human, and that is what makes it extraordinary. He showed us that heroes aren't people without fear. Heroes are people who act despite fear. Leaders aren't the ones who send others into danger. They're the ones who go first. Victory doesn't come from overwhelming strength. It comes from refusing to give up. Every generation faces its own Omaha Beach, a moment when failure seems certain and leadership is required. The question isn't if such a moment will come, but who will step forward when it does. General Norman Cota proved that one person can turn disaster into victory. To the generations that follow, the lesson is clear. When your test comes, when disaster looms and others hesitate, remember the old general who walked upright through machine gun fire, who rallied frightened men, who turned a hopeless situation into one of history's greatest victories. Remember that you too can be that person. You too can make the difference. Today the beach is quiet. Tourists walk the sand where history was written. But for those who fought there, it will always be a place where they discovered what human beings are capable of, when someone shows them the way. General Cota didn't just save Omaha Beach. He saved men from their own fear and from surrender. He proved that victory can come even when defeat looks certain. That is his true legacy. Not just the victory itself, but the knowledge that victory is still possible, even in the darkest hour, if someone has the courage to stand up and say, "Follow me." The hard facts tell the story. 34,000 troops landed on D-Day. 43,000 by D+1. 100,000 by D+5. About 2,400 casualties on D-Day. 4,000 by the end of June 6-7. 206,000 Allied casualties during the Normandy campaign. The gains were hard-won. 5 miles of beach secured on June 6th. 10 square miles of ground held by nightfall. 300 square miles liberated by D+30. France freed in just 85 days. Cota's direct impact is clear in the timeline. First breakthrough achieved at 7:50 a.m. More than 600 troops on the bluffs by 9:00 a.m. 5 exits opened by noon. Omaha secured by nightfall. Historians estimate that without that breakthrough at Dog White Sector, another 5,000 to 10,000 casualties were likely. In the worst case, the beach might have been evacuated and the invasion could have failed altogether, delaying the war by 1 to 2 years and costing another 500,000 to 1 million lives. Today, Norman Dutch Cota's name is remembered across America. The Cota Bridge at Fort Benning stretches across Victory Pond. Cota Hall at West Point houses the Department of Military Instruction. Camp Cota in Vermont trains National Guard units. But his greatest memorial is not made of concrete or steel. It lives in the principle that leadership means going first, that courage spreads to others, and that one person can change the outcome of history. Every officer who learns to lead from the front carries Cota's spirit forward. Every soldier who finds courage in crisis reflects his example. Every leader who steps up while others stand back follows the path he set. The Rangers still honor their motto, words first shouted on that blood-soaked beach. Rangers lead the way. June 6, 1944 proved that disaster can be turned into victory if someone dares to lead. Norman Daniel Cota was that someone. The turnaround at Omaha Beach remains one of history's clearest examples of how individual leadership can decide the fate of nations. In just 3 hours, Cota showed that men, not machines, win battles. He arrived at a place where defeat seemed inevitable and soldiers were frozen in fear. With personal courage and visible leadership, he transformed them into a force that captured the high ground and secured the day. This story resonates far beyond military history. It speaks to every human being who has faced fear, crisis, or the edge of defeat. Cota proved that such moments can be overcome with courage, leadership, and action, even when action feels impossible. His example was not about orders, but about presence. By standing under fire, by going first, by showing instead of telling, he reminded everyone that leadership is built on example, not authority. The men who survived Omaha carried his lessons into their lives. They rebuilt America with the same determination. They raised children with values shaped in fire. They created a world where freedom was defended by the principle that ordinary people, properly led, can accomplish the extraordinary. As the last veterans pass into history, their stories remind us, one person can make a difference. One act of courage can inspire thousands. One leader can turn disaster into victory. That is the eternal message of Omaha Beach. Not that victory is guaranteed, but that it is possible, even in the darkest moments, if someone has the courage to lead. On June 6, 1944, that someone was General Norman Daniel Dutch Cota. His courage showed that the difference between defeat and victory can come down to one leader at one decisive moment. Today, the beach where 2,400 Americans fell is sacred ground. Visitors stand where Cota stood, look up at the cliffs he climbed, and wonder how anyone survived. Many leave in tears, some salute, but all walk away knowing this truth. Freedom exists because one man refused to accept defeat on a morning when everything went wrong. Dutch Cota didn't just save Omaha Beach. He proved that individuals matter. He proved that leadership is real. He proved that courage spreads like wildfire. And he proved that disaster can be turned into victory if someone is willing to go first and say, "Follow me." That is the final lesson of June 6, 1944. When disaster strikes, when defeat seems certain, when fear holds everyone down, someone must step forward. On that morning, on that beach, that someone was Dutch Cota. His example is eternal proof that one person, at the right time, with the right courage, can change the course of history.